Good morning, everybody, and I hope you can hear me and see me, because I'm a bit small and hope I haven't disappeared below the lectern. Excuse me, I will speak in English. I do speak German. If you want to speak to me afterwards, I do speak German, but I'm slightly afraid of speaking in German for my talk, so please excuse me. I'm very honoured to be here today, and I'm going to talk really about perhaps the interregnum of civil society, or the in-between state of civil society in the world, and the strains that civil society is under at the moment, and have come to the surface, particularly since the launch of the War on Terror. And my talk is based on research I've been doing for several years on the impact of the War on Terror on, or counter-terrorism measures that have been introduced since 9/11 on aid policy and civil society, and focusing on the countries of Afghanistan, Kenya, India, and also looking at what has been happening in the US, Europe, and the UK. So I'm going to talk about actually three trends at the global level, which I think are putting a strain on civil society and creating new challenges and dilemmas. And by civil society, I mean all those spaces and organizing activities where citizens become involved in deliberating and acting on public issues, be this through social movements, through NGOs, through street protests, through business associations, faith groups, and so on. And the three trends I think that we need to think about today are, first of all, the global war on terror and its consequences for civil society, which is what I'm mainly going to talk about, but also the current global recession. And I have to admit that I also work a lot on China, so I'm going to talk about the implications, very briefly, about China for civil society more generally. And I'd say that these three trends actually all imply new forms of contestation between states and civil societies as they work together in a strange way to kind of promote a particular vision of civil society. And this is a vision that is amenable, on the one hand, to government manipulation and control, that celebrates civil society as actually a handmaiden to government, particularly in the field of service delivery and international development, and also security, but at the same time seeks to constrain emancipatory forms of civil society. Excuse me. So I'm mainly going to talk about the effects of the war on terror, but at the end I will come back to this issue about the recession and the rise of China. I would like to say, actually, these are very interesting times that we live in. Just before I was leaving the UK to come here, our Prime Minister announced that he would be not averse to using some of the aid budget for peacekeeping operations, for security and demobilization, arguing that security was an important precondition for development. Another Conservative MP came onto the radio in the morning and said, well, security and development, international development, are inextricably linked. This has huge relevance to what I'm going to talk about regarding the war on terror, because we can see that the links between security and development have become increasingly intertwined. And this has been a matter of great concern to many of the international development NGOs, who also came on later in the day on the radio to challenge this possible new approach of the government. So why then has the global war on terror put civil society under strain. How can it that terrorism has anything to do with civil society? And in particular, how can it have anything to do with civil society groups? I mean, groups that are working on human rights issues, on international development, on humanitarianism, and so on. And I argue, on the basis of the research that we have done, that there are actually two competing but complementary dynamics to the impact of the war on terror on state-civil society relations. The first is a dynamic of increasing suspicion and surveillance, and the second is a dynamic of co-opting, working together with civil society organizations in the government's security agendas. Now, this whole dynamic of suspicion and surveillance is, of course, not new. It has antecedents during the Cold War period that we know about. Similarly, there were also antecedents there where groups were perhaps manipulated for the purposes of ideological warfare and so on. What's been very interesting at the end of the Cold War is that period of the late 1980s, 1990s, which I would call the golden era of civil society, when it seemed that NGOs could do no harm, when NGOs, civil society organizations, were celebrated by governments, by international development institutions, by bilateral development institutions, because, and rightly so, because they could play a watchdog role on governance for the purposes of transparency and accountability, for promoting a good governance agenda and democratization. So governments and donors in the late 1980s onwards have begun to court NGOs to work with them on welfare issues, to work with them on good governance issues, and so on. And that's all fine. And in fact, in my own country, under New Labour with Tony Blair, we saw the third way, and we saw the introduction of a new form of engagement between the state and civil society organizations that was being called the Compact Agreement, where voluntary sector organizations would agree with the government to deliver certain services because it was seen that they could do something that governments couldn't do. But when they agreed to this, they said, yes, okay, but there is one condition, and that is, and this they put into the compact agreements, that we must be able still to criticize government policy on behalf of the groups that we're working with and representing. And I'll be coming back to that point later on. Now, at the international level, also, lots of bilateral agencies, multilateral agencies also began to court civil society organizations. They set up civil society units. They employed people to be civil society coordinators, liaison officers, and so on. And they began to develop civil society programs in Afghanistan, in the Eastern Europe, in Africa, and many different countries. Now, what's then interesting is that as we get towards the millennium, the turn of the millennium, these organizations have now about 15, 20 years of experience of working with different civil society organizations. And rightly, they're beginning to take stock of those relationships. What has worked well? What hasn't worked well? Well, we're not quite sure about some of these NGOs. There are now hundreds of them at the NGO Parallel Forum. They're all claiming to represent certain groups and so on. So there are questions there about who do they represent, their probity, their transparency, and so on. And this occurred at a time also when international aid policy was questioning its own modalities. So we have the Paris Declaration and other kind of initiatives. So this was a critical juncture when we began to see doubts being raised about civil society organizations, how best to work with them, you know, who do they really represent? And it was at this juncture that we then had the attacks upon the Twin Towers and the launch of the War on Terror. So we already had a climate emerging of beginning to have doubts about the role of civil society organizations. The War on Terror, as we know, has brought in a lot of changes in the regulatory and legislative frameworks directly concerning counterterrorism and also indirectly. It also, particularly in the initial years, created a climate of fear and certain attitudes of fear and mistrust towards particularly Muslim communities. And it was within this context of heightened fear that NGOs and charities and other civil society groups actually began to be looked at with suspicion. Perhaps they were fronts for terrorist organizations. And some of this suspicion we can see in the statements of political leaders. Now, for example, our own Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, in 2006, famously stated, "We can address directly 3 of the most dangerous sources of terrorist finance: the abuse of charities, the abuse of money service businesses, and the abuse of financial transactions." We know that many charities and donors have been and are being exploited by terrorists. But actually, there's very little evidence for this, as indeed the Charity Commission in the UK has shown many times that this is very, very rare. So what we see happening is a veil of suspicion being cast over civil society and beginning to think about it not as this wonderful sphere of organizations, plurality, democracy, and so on that we should embrace, but actually being made up of good parts and bad parts. Good parts we should work with, encourage, and bad parts we should keep our eye on, control, and survey. And this has led, actually, to certain groups being selectively targeted, one might say, for surveillance or so on, or for being concerned about. In particular, Muslim communities, groups and mosques and Islamic charities and so on have come under scrutiny. Asylum seekers, migrants, charities, particularly those that are working in conflict situations like Afghanistan, or in the Middle East, or in Palestine. And this led, after the launch of the War on Terror, to a raft of new regulations and restrictions coming in many different countries to constrain civil society organizations. Let me just mention 2 or 3 of these from America. For example, if you're an organization working in Afghanistan, you are receiving US funds, or you're working in Palestine or working in Kenya, then you have to sign, your organization has to sign an anti-terrorist certificate saying that none of your staff members have any association with terrorism. Similarly, in the West Bank and Gaza, US aid instituted a new system called the Partner Vetting System, which is actually much more intrusive and requires any organization receiving US funds to relay information, personal details about the trustees of that NGO, the staff members and so on, all of which will go back onto a database in the States for checking against terrorism. And of course you might say, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, the key issue is around the balance between security and freedom. How much freedom are we prepared to forfeit for the sake of security? But it also has very practical consequences for NGOs working in conflict situations in Afghanistan or in Iraq or wherever. For example, on the issue of the material support phrase, the Patriot Act has a clause in it which says that you must not provide material support to a terrorist group. So one of the lawyers who was taking this issue in the courts raised the problem of the material support phrase and said, well, look, what are we going to do? Under Treasury, most recently, the US Treasury issued regulations for Somalia, and you can't build a well for water for a drought-stricken area because someone from Al-Shabaab may come along and drink a cup of water from that. So it raises a whole lot of practical issues. I've only got 5 minutes, goodness. But that's not the whole story. There's also a story about co-optation, about drawing civil society groups into security agendas, a process that we see most sharply in civil-military relations in conflict situations and in the anti-radicalization initiatives at home and abroad. And this more positive approach, actually, of engaging with NGOs for the purposes of security is reflected in the following statements by various officials. First of all, by Colin Powell, stated in 2001, "I want you to know that I'm serious about making sure we have the best relationship with NGOs who are such a force multiplier for us, such an important part of our combat team." So we see here this convergence of the military and the civil coming together, which, and as I mentioned at the start, this is reflected very strongly today in the statement of our Prime Minister, who sees greater convergence of civil and military as very important. So this mirrored also a shift not just from military aggression and hard power, but also to using soft power to achieve political and military objectives. So here we're talking about encouraging dialogue with Islamic groups, winning over moderate voices, courting NGOs in anti-extremism, anti-radicalization projects, both at home and abroad, and promoting development, international development, as an anti-poverty strategy that is actually inextricably linked with fighting terrorism and with our national security. So we see the intensification of what one might call hearts and minds work in Somalia, in Kenya, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And we see then aid projects focusing on anti-radicalization. We see aid being channeled more towards education, to reforming madrasas, and right at ground level, for example, in Afghanistan, we have the provincial reconstruction teams, which bring together the military and the development into humanitarian and development work. So the point is that civil society becomes strategically relevant, not just in terms of poverty reduction and good governance, but also in terms of achieving military objectives and ensuring our national security. This then poses many challenges for civil society, which, if I go back to the idea of the interregnum, I think we're in an in-between stage. Where is civil society going? None of this, of course, sits very easily with some NGOs. It throws up real dilemmas. It creates feelings of distrust between the international NGO and local partners. Aha, so you think we're terrorists. They may be uncomfortable to sign these clauses. Should they work with the military or not? Some do, some don't. There are many different positions about this. And what are the consequences if they do? In yesterday's talk about Afghanistan, we know that international NGOs are very often perceived, and the partners they work with may be perceived as being on the side of the government or on the side of the military, and therefore, in the eyes of the Taliban or the insurgents, a legitimate target for attack. So international development NGOs worry about these issues. So the war on terror has strained civil society in many ways, and I think what is worrying that many of these new restrictions, regulations, laws that have come in since 2001 are still there. We've got very used to them. They've become part of normal life. But we need to ask ourselves, what is happening with state-civil society relations? And I just want to come back now to the two other trends that I talked about. One is the global recession. And I mentioned how under the compact agreement that was signed between the voluntary sector in the UK and the government, they were very happy to work with government, but as long as this did not compromise their right to criticise government policy. Very worryingly, there was recently, this year, a report by an independent panel on the voluntary sector in the UK, which showed that there were fears that actually voluntary sector organisations were self-censoring themselves because they were afraid that with all the cuts, they were no longer going to receive government funding. And I think this is a very, very worrying development in a country like the UK, which has a long, long history of voluntary sector engagement and a strong civil society, that this kind of development is happening. The other emerging strain, and to finish, I would say, relates to China, because China has, like many countries, used the war on terror also to clamp down on secessionist movements in Xinjiang and Tibet and so on. The Chinese Communist Party is not actually against civil society. In fact, it's been developing its own strategy for encouraging a particular vision of civil society. And this is one, of course, where, yes, we'd like service delivery NGOs, but please don't criticize the party, the government. Please don't claim rights or demand democracy. And why I think this is important is because China is becoming a more important donor in countries like Africa, but is also being seen as a model, as a way of development that brings not only economic growth, but also retains an authoritarian system of rule, where a particular vision of civil society, one which is about service delivery, but not about participation, criticism, emancipation. So we are living, I would say, in a time now where there are competing imaginations of the shape, purpose, and desirability of civil society. Suspicion and surveillance traverse the terrain of civil society just as much as functionality and utility do as well. We've looked at some of these constraining influences, but of course how this all turns out will depend on the responses of civil society groups, whether they acquiesce or whether they resist, whether they comply with these new visions coming from government about relations with civil society, or whether they forge alternatives, and whether they privilege government funding over other types of funding that value perhaps solidarity. So these are interesting times we live in, maybe an interregnum, but they're also very worrying times for those who are concerned, like I am, about the spaces for citizen deliberation and action. Thank you very much.